Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone to today's Learning Tuesdays webinar. As we continue to track educational recovery post-pandemic, there's growing amount of data that highlights both progress and ongoing challenges. And so today we have the opportunity to look at some new reports released this year from Curriculum Associates, NWEA, and McKinsey Company that really provide insights on the pace of recovery into the 23-24 school year, as well as the achievement gaps that remain. And so joining us today, we have authors from each of these reports who I have the pleasure of introducing. Our first is Dr. Megan Caulfield, who is the Director of Growth Modeling and Analytics at NWEA. Her research seeks to understand students' academic, social, and emotional trajectories and the school and neighborhood influences that promote optimal growth. We also have Doug, a senior expert in McKinsey & Company's global education practice, where he supports K-12 and higher education clients seeking to expand opportunity and increase equity across the U.S. and globally. We have with us today Dr. Kelsey Young, who leads the Research, Insights, and Analytics team at Curriculum Associates and conducts research evaluating national trends in student achievement. We also have with us a phenomenal group of commentators who will help us explore these new reports and how their insights can inform our collective efforts to accelerate equitable academic recovery. And so they are Dr. Lucrecia Santibanez, professor at UCLA's School of Education and Information Studies, and faculty co-director of the UCLA's Center for the Transformation of Schools. She studies how to improve teaching and learning for vulnerable populations, including emergent bilingual students. We have Dr. Allison Rose Skokul, who serves as EdTrust's Vice President of P12 Policy, Practice, and Research. She leads the P12 team to highlight inequities, identify research-based solutions, and work with a wide range of equity advocates to push for change that will expand excellence and equity. And we have with us Robert Runcie, who's the Chief Education Officer of Chiefs for Change, developing educators ready to lead K-12 systems. And of course, our conversation today will be moderated by Hetty Chang, who is the founder and executive director of Attendance Works, a national and state level initiative aimed at advancing student success by addressing chronic absence. And so I am going to pass it over to Hetty for the rest of our conversation today.
Great. And maybe we can stop showing the slide. Yeah. It's such a pleasure to be here, Hillary. The campaign, I think, does all of us such a great service by helping make sure we are attentive to the latest data, the latest research, and making sure that we're using that to inform our actions across the country. So we're going to start. We're actually going to start the session by asking Kelsey and Megan in particular to help us understand what are we seeing overall in the data and how are we seeing disparities in academic recovery. And then after they have a chance to talk about that, we're going to explore what are we hearing about what works, how are districts thinking about that, what are they seeing in their data, and then we're going to have a chance for our commentators to come in and talk about what does this mean for multilingual learners, what does this mean on the ground in schools and districts, and what does that mean for advocates. And now we have Kelsey set up. So Kelsey, thank you so much for being here, and take it away. What are we seeing about academic recovery for our kids post-pandemic?
Yeah, thank you, Hetty. Please also interrupt me. I just got the dreaded your internet connection able, so fingers crossed this goes smoothly, but please interrupt me if something is not going well. Yeah, thank you, Hetty, for the and to speak with those questions. I'm going to share some research that we released this summer. I'll do quick overviews of the purpose, the approach, results, and then a discussion to summarize what we think all of this means. And since I'm presenting a lot of data, I'll call out as we go along kind of the big consistent findings we're seeing over and over that speak to those questions. All right. You all are seeing my slides, yes? We're seeing
Yes.
the slides, we're good? Fabulous. Okay, thank you. Now, much of this work and conversation is really trying to of academic recovery. And I think with COVID relief funds expiring, there's been pressure to understand if students are closer to performing where they were pre-pandemic. And research and headlines have shown somewhat mixed findings around if recovery is happening, who it's happening for, and if relief funds had the intended effect. But research does agree that nationally students are behind where they were pre-pandemic. So we wanted to get a better sense of this and look at it for student groups and school populations to understand where some of this variability might be coming from. So in our first study that I'm going to talk about, we evaluated the average academic growth for students starting in 2021, so the first school year back, through this most recent spring, plotting their scores from 3 test administrations, fall, winter, and spring, for 3 years. We looked at historical growth, so that's 2016 to 2019, and then compared it to post-pandemic. If students were able to come into school in the fall of 2021 without missing a beat, this is what their growth would have looked like. It's pretty similar to historical, but we know students came in a lot less prepared in 2021. Their scores were quite a bit lower. So even though they made similar gains in growth, it wasn't enough to keep them on par with where students had historically been. Now, like I said, we wanted to explore variability in these trends. So we looked at this data for 4 other cohorts, or students who were different ages during the pandemic. I just got a note that said audio issues. Is anyone else experiencing that?
You're still okay, Kelsey. I can still hear you. So
Okay,
keep going.
perfect. Let me know if anyone else can. Looking at that data, we see many of these cohorts are also not demonstrating the growth needed to catch up to historical. So if we zoom back in on our grade 2 to 4 cohort to make sense of what we're looking at, we can kind of get a sense of these graphs. So here we're concerned with how close that solid line is to the gray area. So within that gray area, those scores are roughly the same as historical scores. But outside of that, where we have the asterisks, means those scores are significantly different from historical scores. And if we take this cohort, for example, scores are much closer this past spring than they were in the fall of 21, indicating some small recovery over time. So if we look at this for all of these cohorts again, we see the decline post-pandemic was larger for younger students that we evaluated, or students who were K-2 in 2021. And our older cohorts, students who were grades 2 to 4 in 2021, or 3 to 4, are much closer to historical scores as of this spring. If we look at math data, we saw pretty similar results in that students were not demonstrating the growth needed to catch up to historical scores in most cohorts. The only cohort we really see evidence of recovery is our oldest, or students we followed from grade 4 to grade 6. So if we zoom in there, scores are still below historical as of this spring, but students are much closer than they were in the fall of 21, again, indicating that there is some recovery happening here. Now, both subjects saw some recovery in older students, but the initial declines immediately post-pandemic were larger in math, indicating there's just a little more ground to make up. But again, we really wanted to understand who these patterns held true for. So we broke out results by student starting placement level, or where they placed relative to their chronological grade level in the fall of 21. So here we're looking at only that grade 2 to 4 cohort again for reading. It's the same data, scores over time, with the dotted line and that shaded region representing historical scores and what we count as close to those scores, but now for 3 different groups of students. The green representing students who began or started in 2021 on grade level, yellow, students who began 1 grade level below, and red is students who started 2 or more grades behind their chronological grade. So this really helped us identify where there were differences in post-pandemic recovery. We saw that these decreases were larger for lower performing students. They were not keeping pace with how these same students have scored historically, and growth since has indicated better recovery for some groups, but not others. Now, the last way we parsed this data was looking at school characteristics, one being school demographic makeup. And we see pretty similar growth patterns. The lines are pretty parallel, but how far they are from historical scores, or that gray area and dotted line, really differs by school characteristic. So here we see how disparities have really continued for historically underserved communities. Now, all of this information from our growth study was really helpful for getting a sense of what student growth has looked like pre and post-pandemic. But it didn't really answer where students ended after these 3 years. So we wanted to know, where do these different growth trajectories put students relative to grade level? So that brings us to the second study we released this summer, which is our State of Student Learning, the second report, which at a very high level just evaluates the proportion of students who make it to grade level in the spring and compares those numbers across years. And looking at results, we see some pretty consistent findings with other research. So this plots just the proportion of students on grade level in reading by year and grade. And we see large drops immediately post-pandemic for our younger grades with pretty limited change since. See little bits of recovery from 22 to 23, but everything's pretty stagnant from then on. But again, we see our younger students, again, students who are in K to 2, saw larger initial decreases than our older students. And looking at that same data for math, the decreases are again larger for younger students, but they're also larger overall in math, as we've seen with some of our other research, these initial decreases. And then examining these trends by school characteristics again, we do see our majority Black schools demonstrate a small but encouraging gain in the percentage of grade level students. But despite this gain, these schools and majority Hispanic schools are still below pre-pandemic trends, and they're still below majority white schools. Again, showing evidence of the continued disparities for a lot of our underserved communities. So, given all that data and some of the variation we've seen, let's summarize and discuss those findings, which transparently are not fantastic and a little bit of bummer findings. The question then became for us, where, if anywhere, do these trends look different? Well, for each of those consistent findings that we have here, there were kind of these baby pockets of recovery within each that offer some insight. So in addition to seeing these larger decreases for younger students, we did see some recovery in older cohorts, and older being students who were in grade 3, 4 in 2021. In reading, the 3 oldest cohorts are on par or close to historical scores as of this spring. And in math, there's a similar trend, again, for that oldest cohort. And though, again, we saw larger declines in math, there was some nice recovery in reading, as we saw on the previous slide. And we looked at results by domain level performance. We saw our grade K students make some small recovery in their phonics performance, with almost the same proportion of students on grade level this spring as the spring prior to the pandemic. And then we saw, unfortunately, our students who started well below grade level experience declines and are not keeping pace with historical growth trends for these students. But we also saw students who started just a little below make some encouraging growth. So again, looking at that grade 2 to 4 cohort, we see students who started a grade level below are actually exceeding their own historical growth as of this spring. And again, we unfortunately saw continued disparities, but we also saw some exciting gains in the proportion of on-grade level students in majority Black schools. So this kind of left us with, what did the bummer findings but tiny spots of progress tell us? And when we think about the small pockets of recovery, we think that they may be due to these groups just having resources or practices that worked well for them. And I want to be clear, we did not test any of these interventions, but we simply hypothesized, given what we know about the current state of education and efforts, what might be working. And I think my colleagues will be able to offer more insight here. So the recovery in older cohorts, upper elementary, could just be a result of intervention efforts simply targeting older students. This is when most state testing starts, and previous and other research has identified older students as more impacted. Any small recovery in reading and phonics performance could be resulting from substantial policy efforts targeting the science of reading. Recovery by some students near grade level could be the result of a lot of approaches utilizing supplemental instruction. We knew that was a common practice post-pandemic. And it's an approach that can work really well for students who are close to grade level, but just need a little more support. And then the small progress in some underserved communities could indicate recovery efforts are working for these students, but it's just not enough to remove existing disparities. So if we follow these assumptions, this tells us that the practice or policy in the places we saw recovery were just really well matched. So this indicated to us that implementation factors were really the key consideration, or this idea that it's not necessarily the practice, the program, the intervention itself, but all the barriers that get in the way of realizing the benefit. The policies in place, systemic barriers, misalignment of practice and population, trouble with dosage or scale. And that districts really require more support addressing those things. So that is all I had prepared. So I'm going to pass it off to my colleagues to be able to offer more insight into the latter half of that question as well.
Great. So we're going to shift from Kelsey to Megan, who's going to talk about how does what did Curriculum Associates see compared to what we're seeing in from some other data sources. And I also want to encourage folks, if you want to ask questions in the chat, questions, you can put them in the Q&A. We will get them to them. We'll take a look at them, and we'll also have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of this. But so, Megan, how does what Kelsey showed compare to what you've seen?
Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Kufeld. I'm coming from NWEA, and like Kelsey at Curriculum Associates, we've been kind of tracking this COVID impacts and recovery story for a number of years. So I'm going to take a step back and try to pull our data from NWA as well as some other data sources together to kind of look at what we see in terms of recovery across data sets over the last 3 years. So what we're seeing in this figure, and I should say I have a QR code in the bottom if you're interested in the report. I believe the link will also be shared. This is a Brookings blog that was released a couple weeks ago. So what we're seeing here is the standardized score drops. The y-axis is in standard deviation units relative to 2019 mean. So 2019 being our historic data. And we're seeing 3 different data sets: the NWA map growth assessment, data from the Renaissance assessment, as well as the Education Recovery Scorecard, which pulls together a number of state assessments and links them to the NAEP scale. So the 0 point on this scale would be when scores have equaled what we saw historically before COVID, so equal to the 2019 mean. So focusing first on the left, we see scores for ELA and reading, with a trend of basically stagnation, some improvements from 22 to 23 for the education recovery scorecard, but basically flat data from 22 to 23 for the other 2 data sets. NWA of these 3 data sets, the only one who's released 2024 data so far for the spring. And unfortunately, we saw continued declines in English, in ELA reading. And I should say this is focused exclusively on students who are in grades 3 to 8 in each of these years, so not including those younger kids that Kelsey was referring to in K to 2. But some kind of alarming trends that we see in terms of really not a huge recovery story across our data sets in reading.
And Megan, one quick question. This is all national data sets?
These are all national. They're not each individually nationally representative. So like the Education Recovery Scorecard, I believe, has about 26 states included. NWA and Renaissance both have most states included, but they're not inherently nationally representative the way NAEP would be. So they're national slices, but not all the same samples in schools.
Great,
yeah, thank you for that clarification. And shifting over to math, we see both kind of larger initial drops paralleled with what Kelsey had reported, but we also see a more positive recovery story in grades 3 to 8, particularly from 22 to 23. So all 3 data sets that we looked at were showing good signs of recovery, though clearly still far from that historical average. So impressive signs from 22 to 23 of growth, not enough to get us back to where we were before. And then unfortunately for the NWA data, we see just signs of stagnation after that initial improvement from 22 to 23. So we will be seeing new NAEP data, I should also mention, this winter, which will give us another look at this, the best national look at these trends, particularly in grade 4 to 8. But I'd say kind of the overall story we're seeing so far is some improvement in math, it's still a long way to go to recovery. So if we could go to the next slide, please. We also wanted to take a look at this with state summative data. So we took all the states that we could find that had released their spring 22 and spring 23 assessment, so the percent proficiency rates, and classified those states into whether they showed continued declines between 22, 23, minimal change, making progress, which was an improvement rate of at least 2 percentage points or more, or had recovered or exceeded their 2019 rates. We were doing this before the 2024 results had started streaming out, so it's not completely up to date, but I would say the 2024 results are pretty parallel to what we see in 2023. So just as a whole, most states are kind of in the minimal change or making some progress. Only a very small number of states have reported recovery. So that includes Mississippi, Tennessee, and Iowa. But the vast majority of states are still below where they were in 2019. The other thing I would note about state results, and many of you maybe have experienced this in your own state, is a good number of states have changed their assessment in the last couple of years. So this is really focusing on states that were able to keep their assessment, keep their cut scores across time. But the story gets a lot harder to tell in states that are changing their assessment or changing their proficiency cut score, because then it is harder to look back over time. But I think this just continues kind of to show the story that there is some pockets of recovery, but there's still a long way to go for many places. And the next slide, please. And so the final thing we wanted to touch on with our results, parallel to what a lot of what Kelsey had said, is just that we're continuing to see uneven recovery progress. One really bright spot is, in addition to the curriculum associates data, both the recovery scorecard and the NWEA data shows promising recovery for Black students, so above average recovery rates. Unfortunately, that does not seem to hold true for Hispanic students or other economically disadvantaged students, which are continuing to recover at lower rates. And then just zooming in just on the NWEA data, we found that the students who are current ninth graders, so we're at 8th grade at the end of the last school year, are a full school year behind pre-pandemic levels. So that was a real, both in math and in reading. So that was a real kind of alarm bell going off in the NWEA data, that these kids who have now transitioned into high school are probably getting less supports than they were getting in the younger grades, are now being set off on these more rigorous tracks potentially and underprepared for the high school curriculum.
Thank you, Megan. It's sobering. Seems like we still have a long ways to go. There are a few places that are getting some results, but some real challenges with some populations still struggling pretty significantly. Doug, we would like to start exploring this issue as we've sort of gotten a glimpse of the challenge that lies in front of us. What are we starting to hear about what actually works to get to recovery? What might help us know where we're getting the results and what more we need to do?
Yes, for sure. And I think we'll talk in a moment about what the research is showing actually is working, but I thought it'd be interesting to share with this group what folks think is working and what their priorities might be looking ahead. So what we're sharing here is a result from a survey that we did with over 400 district leaders, sort of asking them about their pandemic spending and asking two questions. What's their sense for what worked? And then, do you wish you spent more, or do you wish you had spent less? And so if you look in the upper right, this is what we call sort of the double down quadrant. These are places where at least the perception from district leaders was these things are working. And in retrospect, we wish we had spent more on these issues. So things that you'll see up there are things like addressing challenges in mental health, ensuring equitable outcomes, social emotional learning. And then you see this push on unfinished learning, first on the tutoring front, and also on the technology front. So a lot of things where they're saying like, look, we thought these things were making a difference. And, you know, if we had it to do over again, which I'm sure no one wants to do it over again, but if we had to do it over again, we wish we had spent more there. I think what's also interesting is to look at the bottom right, because these are places where they're not sure if what they did worked, but they still feel like I wish we had spent more, which I think is an indication of a real tough challenge that they acknowledge is really hard to deal with. They feel like we could have done, should have done more, but even what they did may not have moved the needle, at least in their perception. And down there, you see things like student absenteeism, addressing the needs of special education students, and then dealing with and managing and supporting challenges in student behavior. And then just, we won't spend much time here, but on the left, you see other places where they sort of say, look, these are places where, we probably wouldn't have spent as much if we had our choice. Upper left is sort of stuff we kind of had to spend money on, devices, things like that, or maybe we did some capital investments. And then the bottom left was, we don't think it really worked, and we wish we spent even less on it. And that's interesting because it's always hard as a district leader to make these priorities. But hopefully this sort of informs what at least the folks in the seats felt was working and wish they had spent even more money on. And then one more thing on the next slide, just to highlight, this is where we then ask them, okay, when you think about your budget going forward and then over the next 3 years, what are the key priorities you are planning to spend more money on or prioritize in your budget? And that first column is for all districts, and that's probably the column to keep an eye on. You see, those top 4: student behavior, retaining staff, absenteeism, student mental health. Right? More than half of districts are saying, yes, that's got to be in our top priority set. And then on the right, you do see, some puts and takes, whether you're a lower income, middle income, or higher income district. And then as you sort of go further down the list, you start to see the drop off where people are looking at, fewer and fewer districts are still prioritizing things like hiring more instructional staff, or if you get really further down the list, investing in devices, presumably because they've done a lot of that already. But just wanted to set the stage a little bit with where they did spend the money and what their reflections are on that, what they're looking at going forward, to sort of set the stage to actually talk about what the data is telling us on what's working.
Yeah, thank you so much, Doug. That's so helpful. And Megan, we'd love for you to tell us more about, so what does the data suggest is working?
Great. Yeah, so I'm going to be sharing some brief results from a partnership that we call the Road to Recovery Partnership. It's a joint work between NWEA, the Center for Education Policy Research at Harvard, and the Calder Institute at AIR. And this was a large initiative to look at academic interventions, particularly ones that were providing supplemental instruction during the summer and the school year. I'm going to focus most recently on the results that were released for the 22-23 school year, as well as for the summer of 22 for those summer programs. So we had 8 districts that participated in this evaluation of their intervention programs, all very large public US districts. And there were kind of 6 categories of interventions that were tried in these districts in the school year. So tutoring, one we hear a lot about, one of the most popular, as well as small group instruction, after school programs, so providing not just standard after school, but providing instructional time in an after school program, academically oriented summer programs, extended school year, so adding some instructional days to the end or the beginning of the school year, expert teachers, which in this instance is being defined as teachers who have very high evaluation ratings who are being paired with struggling students. So that is the one exception to the additional instructional time. That is just a different kind of arrangement of students and teachers rather than supplementing instructional time. And then finally, using digital learning platforms as an intervention. So these were all evaluated in the 22 to 23 school year period in 8 different districts. In total, there were about 25 separate programs running. If we could go to the next slide, please. So what do we see from these evaluations of these programs? Unfortunately, we saw null effects for 3 of the different intervention types. So after school programs, extended school year, digital learning, null effects across the board. We did see positive effects for tutoring, though it was only really for one of the tutoring programs in the district, and that was the one that had the least number of students served, but the highest dosage. So they were serving about 1 to 2% of the students in their district, but with 30 or more additional hours of instruction in the school year. The summer programs that the districts ran did have an average positive effect in math, but not in reading. And the expert teachers did actually have positive effects and sizable positive effects for both subjects. So I think you could look at this both glass half empty, glass half full. There are definitely things that are working. I think there are some big challenges that districts have faced in the last couple of school years implementing and scaling these programs. So I think that is really the key challenge is not kind of what programs are the ones that should be used. It's how do we make those actually effective in the context of school districts.
So you were able to look at quality as well as you were assessing whether the implementation had worked?
Yeah, and particularly dosage and number of students reached. That was a place where almost all the interventions were not able to reach as many students as they had initially set out to, and the dosage was often much lower than the intended intervention plan.
Maybe let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, so if we could go the next slide, please. So, I mean, I think this results from the Road to Recovery project. Matthew Kraft has released some recent results looking at this specifically with tutoring. I think the clear pattern we're seeing is that there's a trade-off between scale and impact. So the higher impact interventions are often the ones that are serving the smaller number of students. So when they're scaled up to try to serve a good number of students that we know have fallen behind during the pandemic, those were less likely to be to result in positive test scores in math or reading compared to the kind of business as usual things that are happening in schools. So we can see, we can see positive effects. There are tutoring programs that are having positive effects. It's just hard to get those to serve the number of students that districts need in order to really make a big dent in the recovery that we're looking for.
Thank you, Megan. And I think this does connect to the question that we had gotten from Town Lasky. Well, the next part for you, Doug, is, so what do we know about states or places that are actually effective at scaling, at moving this work? And let's go to the next slide.
Yes, no, happy to dive in, and let me provide a little bit of context because I think this helps inform the conversation we'll have in a bit. Essentially, what we did is looked across the globe, did interviews with 200 plus leaders, donors, et cetera, and honed in on 14 systems that had sustained and outsized growth, sustained it over time, and done it on a consistent basis, trying to sort of suss out what are some of the lessons learned.
And Doug, let me just clarify. In this case, the research was both international as well as domestic?
That's right. Thank you. Right. So we were looking across the globe. We've done these prior reports that looked at sort of the highest performing systems in the world, the most improved school systems in the world. And this was us sort of revisiting that and asking ourselves who had retained and sustained improvements over time, and just trying to, again, pull out those lessons, which we'll go into in a minute. The reason I think that context is important is I should note it doesn't speak directly to the interventions we were just describing, but I do think there are lessons learned in what those districts found, both what in terms typically gets in the way, but also what the successful systems found that made a difference that could sort of apply to the question and the thing we're wrestling with as a group, which is what can we learn from what's working and what can we learn or do differently where it's not. So just a few things I would highlight coming out of those conversations with systems about what gets in the way, right? And I don't think anyone on the call will find these a foreign concept, but I think it's helpful to sort of articulate these kind of failure modes that we heard, right? So the first was conflicting directions. So we don't know where we're going, right? So is there a clear alignment? Are we going left? Are we going right? And there's often uncertainty in systems about what the priorities are and what we're going to do. Leadership discontinuity, really that sense that when the new person comes in, we throw out everything we were doing and bring on something new. And we all are familiar with the instability that can really cause as a big pain point. What we call the organ rejection of reform, right? So this might be a great idea, but if it's not designed and rolled out and engaged and co-created the right way, even if it's a great idea, it just doesn't get done because people say we weren't part of this process, we weren't consulted. Insufficient coordination and pace. I think we've all probably felt this too, where you sort of get off to the races, but the thing can sort of collapse under its own weight if there isn't that ongoing sustained drumbeat, limited capacity to implement, right? It's just sort of like, let's go do it, but there isn't the support to make that implementation happen. Flying blind, right? Thankfully, the call today, we're hearing about data, we're looking at what's working, what's not with facts, but sometimes systems feel like we can't really tell what's even being implemented well, let alone what's working on the for students, and then standing still, right? So this is just, we're stuck in the past, we're piloting, we're not really like moving forward. So these were the things that emerged as failure modes. And then what I want to talk about on the next slide is what we then sort of boiled that into in terms of what we have seen work in places that overcome these failure modes to hit more sustained practices. So if we could go to the next slide. So there's sort of two parts here that I think are important to understand. And the shorthand really is like the left-hand side here is the what, and the right-hand side is the how. And I think a lot of us work on and think a lot about the what are the right things we should be doing? What are the interventions we should be doing? And I think over time, thanks to all the great work of researchers out there, the consistency on what we should be doing, there's more and more and more alignment on the what. I think what we found then to overcome those pain points is what are the things that highly successful systems do to get the how right, to get that sustained impact and scalable reforms over time right. And again, let me offer this and then excited for the go forward discussion. The last thing I'll say before I do that is the report, which I would highlight. I know it's going to be shared with you all. One of my favorite parts of it is the case studies that really get into, but wait, what does this really mean? So often I find people will say, oh, we've set fewer priorities to get things done. Trust me, like we've been more focused. And then when you see when a system really does it, how specific they are and how narrow they are. And you're like, oh, wait, we didn't go that far. And it's really helpful to understand what it really looks like in practice. So I think those case studies are a rich source of insight to dig into when you have a chance. But the 7 how levers, first is this durable coalition for change, fewer priorities to get more done, get leadership and cultivate engagement and enthusiasm for reforms beyond that single leader who may be sort of the mantle for it, and then really engaging educators and families authentically, right? Bringing their voices in, shaping the path with their input, not just developing it and then sort of like pushing it out for buy-in, so to speak. Creating delivery capacity to scale. So are you really building that coordination and cadence for change so you actually have plans, budgets, timelines that you can hold yourselves accountable to, and then having the structures and supports to make it happen, and then driving and adapting with data. And thankfully, there's more and more data out there, but people's ability to actually use it, to actually look at it, and to ask the right questions with it that influence what they do next isn't as prevalent as you'd hope. And so by putting all of these ingredients together, those are the things we've seen in those systems that have truly kind of raised the game over time and kept it there for their students.
All right. I think you have maybe one more slide, Doug.
No, I think I covered you. We can flip to
everything
the next
with
slide.
here. Okay,
Yes.
perfect. So then we are gonna just go. We're gonna shift off and go to our comment. Our participants who are gonna give commentary, and so we're gonna start with Lucrecia Santabanez. Lucrecia, so I know you really looked at what's been happening with multilingual learners, and I want to keep on this emphasis on both what's happening, how are they faring in this, and then let's talk about what do we know needs to happen for that group of learners.
Thank you, Hetty. Yes, most of my research focus on multilingual learners or EL classified students. And as Kelsey already indicated in her part of the presentation, we still have disparities in learning recovery rates that are affecting disproportionately. She mentioned Latinx communities, which have a lot of EL classified children be part of Latinx communities, but also we see it in other reports that have recently come out about EL in particular and their learning outcomes not really catching up. In addition, we also saw, and I saw this in my own research, that the chronic absenteeism problem remains a high risk for this population. By the way, many of you know, I saw in the chat, many of you work in school districts or in advocacy groups. English learner classified children were not a group that had, at least in California and other states, super high absenteeism rates, at least not compared to other similar populations. But after COVID, something shifted. and their numbers are not back to what we're seeing. And when we have very low engagement, we know what happens to their outcomes. We know what happens to graduation rates and a lot of other things that we care about. So something shifted, and we need to understand it better. I loved all the research that was presented here today of trying to really see how districts were thinking about funding and how to move forward. I think with this particular population of multilingual children, there's a lot that we still don't know. And I'd love to see if anyone in the chat, anyone working in a school district or in an advocacy group would want to share anything that you're seeing. We know that there was a lack of services during the pandemic. We don't know the longer or the medium-term effects of that in terms of literacy and linguistic development. There's some research that's come out about maybe almost like a cultural shift in terms of how parents and students themselves are seeing engagement. I haven't really seen a lot of that research focus on multilingual learners. A lot of their parents are immigrant parents. We know immigrant communities care a lot about education. So I'm not so sure whether that culture shift applies to this population. We see a lot of sort of the mental health issues affecting children's engagement overall. And we know that the EL community, students of color were disproportionately hit. Their communities were very hard hit by the pandemic. So there could be some of that. And we also know that culturally sustaining parental engagement is really key. So I'm very happy to see in what Doug presented that even though districts see sort of low efficacy of these, that maybe it's an issue of how do we crack it, right? I'm glad to see.
Well, it could be the districts, I mean, definitely Doug shared, districts felt like they weren't as effective in their investments of chronic absenteeism. I think maybe one of the things you're suggesting is you have to unpack better why kids aren't missing. If it's because they don't have access to healthcare, it's because they don't have effective multilingual communications between teachers and kids. Those are all different kinds of solutions that you'd have to be informed not only by who's most affected, but what you know about why they aren't showing up.
Absolutely. And just to finish up with that, I am happy to see it's still a priority. It's still a funding priority because it's very important. And the last thing I'm going to say is, you know, to your point, Hetty, of really trying to understand what is going on. We saw, I did a study last year in the Center for the Transformation of Schools on MTSS interventions here in California.
And how, what is MTSS, Lucretia? Just
multiple systems of multi-tiered systems of support. So they're the ways the state provides guidance and support to districts that are struggling. And it has 3 tiers. And the first tier is universal support. So everyone gets them. And then tier 2 is more focused. And then 3 tier is super focused. And we saw, for example, in our sample of districts that we visited, that whenever districts started to get concerned about absenteeism for ELs and they started to reach out to parents, it was mostly at the tier 2 and tier 3. So and a lot of the parents said, you know, I wish we had known earlier. I wish we could have done something. So there's definitely an opportunity to involve parents and immigrant parents and parents that are coming from these communities earlier so that they can be truly bidirection, you know, two-way, and that they can be culturally sustaining. And I'll stop there and let the others talk. We can talk about this more later if people are interested.
Thank you so much, Lucretia. Bob, I would love to have you join with your background with Chiefs for Change and also having been a superintendent yourself in Broward County. How do you see this playing out in districts and communities, both the challenge, you know, the challenges to making recovery happen, and what are you starting to see as where there might be some solutions?
And sure. So, you know, I spent the last 24 hours reaching out to colleagues in our network in Florida because of the coming hurricane. So I hope everyone's safe. But one thing I know about hurricanes, once you go through it and you see some of the consequences that it can bring on communities and infrastructure, you know, the approach isn't to go to build back homes and roads and infrastructure exactly the way it was before. You try to find better ways to do it. Unfortunately, what I see too often is that our definition of getting out of this pandemic is to basically go back to where we were before. It's a kind of a low bar when in many systems where they were before, only a third of the kids were actually reading at grade level or being able to do math. So I don't think that should be the goal of where we're trying to get to, is back to where we were before. But how can we get to a whole different place? And so I think that there's, in my view, a lack of boldness and vision about what we ought to try to accomplish. The other observation I would have is that the problems that we have, that our systems are facing, are so complex. When you look at the challenges around learning acceleration, mental health and well-being, chronic absenteeism, the systems weren't designed, nor do they have the resources to address these issues themselves. And even if they did, we got to come to the reality that kids spend almost 80% of their time on average outside of school buildings and school campuses. So if we're going to address these challenges that we're seeing, we have to have a different approach. I believe that requires collaboration and coordination of community-based assets and resources in a way that we can develop the kind of wraparound services to address these externalities: housing insecurity, food insecurity, lack of access to healthcare, poverty and challenges that occur out there. All of those things are impacting the ability to recover from the pandemic. And so I think it creates a new opportunity for us to rethink how we structure our public education system and how we partner with the right folks in the community. And so I think for leaders, what I would say is that we have to redefine the role of a superintendent, for example, right? It can't be that you're just the academic leader trying to find the best high quality instructional materials. You actually need to be a civic leader who is working on behalf of the district to bring those kind of resources and wraparound services that kids need in order to be successful, because those barriers are significant. Those barriers impact implementation, the effectiveness of programs. Our current systems, again, and our structures are not designed for recovery, much less acceleration. So there has to be some significant changes, not only within the systems themselves in terms of how we think about the work, but also how we provide services to students in the community.
That is so helpful. Allison, and I'm actually going to encourage Lucretia and Allison and Bob to stay on camera for a bit, because we're going to have a bit more of a free-flowing, but I'm going to have Allison, what does this mean for advocates, folks who are concerned about equity?
Thanks, Hetty. I'm so grateful to the researchers at the top of this presentation for the data they shared, really highlighting what we know, which is that the pandemic exacerbated resource inequities and opportunity gaps that have existed for way too long for Black and Latino students, for students from low-income backgrounds, for multilingual learners, for students with disabilities. And we see slower recovery for those students because of the disproportionate impact of the pandemic and those longstanding inequities. And so what that means from an equity perspective is that this is more than ever the time to double down on the things that we know work. Things like investing in students' social, emotional, and academic development, a strong and diverse educator workforce, targeting resources to meet the needs of multilingual learners and students with disabilities, and implementing the kinds of strategies that have been highlighted here that, when implemented well, can really address students' unfinished learning. And so advocates have two really important roles to play here. One is to push. One is to demand that equity be at the center of conversations about resource allocation and policy decisions, to demand information from state and district leaders about what data they're using to inform their decisions. What do they know about the interventions that have been implemented, how well they worked, for which students? What is their plan to sustain those interventions? How are they targeting resources to the students who need it most? Doug shared in his data that low-income districts were less likely to prioritize, for example, mental health supports. If you're an equity advocate in a district that is deprioritizing mental health supports, you should sound the alarm. How was that decision made? Who was engaged in that decision? What parents or community members were at the table when decisions to pull mental health supports were made? The other important rule is to provide cover, particularly for when we do have leaders who are trying to do something bolder than just get us back to the status quo. In this political climate in particular, prioritizing equity isn't always easy. And there will be state and district leaders who are going to try to do what is right for students of color, for students from low-income backgrounds, for multilingual learners and students with disabilities. And they are going to need us. They're going to need equity advocates to be loud and vocal in support of those decisions, so that those decisions about how resources are allocated, about rigorous and relevant curriculum, about creating inclusive, safe environments where students attend school regularly, are made with evidence at the forefront and are made informed by all parents and not a loud minority.
So I'm curious, and I'm gonna also, because I know that this advocacy issue is also coming at a time when we're seeing an end of ESSER funds, right? What does that mean for this work? Are there particular things we need to think about? And I'm going to go back to you, Bob, again, because of the roles that you've had in the system. What are the implications of the fact that ESSER funds are ending at this very moment when we have, in some ways, even expanded inequities that are even worse than before the pandemic? And you need to unmute for a moment, and then that will.
Yeah, no, I think we need to adopt things out of the playbook that you find in any business, right? When your funds are constrained, you need to figure out how to prioritize them. And one of the things we did working in places like Indianapolis is we worked with them to create an academic return on investment model that allowed them to identify which investments during ESSER were actually providing the greatest return in terms of student outcomes. And so when those funds run out, you're able to have a menu that's prioritized of where you're going to be able to get impact. So I think you need to think about changing the budget model that you have and how you actually do your spending. In addition to the ESSER funds declining, we also know there's significant declines in enrollment driven by a lot of it driven by declining birth rates and so on in this country. So the current business model in terms of how it's structured with large amounts of fixed costs and assets and the declining market share and revenue base, I mean, that's just not sustainable, right? So again, I think we have to rethink the educational model, and systems are under enormous amount of pressure right now. And I think those that are going to survive and pave the way for a different type of systems, are those, again, that are going to be bold and be in an environment with a governance structure and local leaders that are willing to support something that's very different than the way it's structured now because it's not sustainable.
Allison, would you add anything to this?
Just echo 100% on prioritization, and in particular, looking to where existing funding streams like Title I funding and state funding can be used to sustain the investments that we know worked. That, of course, means a lot of really difficult decisions. I don't want to undersell how hard it is to make decisions about where to allocate resources. The other thing I'll just add, though, is that ESSER came at a time when we really, really needed it in an unprecedented time in this country. But many of us knew, as amazing and much needed as those dollars were, that in those early days of the pandemic, we knew that full academic recovery was going to require a much greater and more sustained investment. And so while in the short term, we need particularly district leaders to be making, to be prioritizing, we also need to advocate for more and more equitable funding. We've had an inequitable and under-resourced education system for far too long, where districts that serve particularly students of color and students from low-income backgrounds get less when they need more. And so I would encourage you to thank you, Hillary, for putting the link in the chat. We have a resource with questions that advocates can ask both their state leaders and their district leaders about both how they are prioritizing existing funds and how they are making decisions to ensure that in the long run, we have a system that can meet the needs of all students.
Yeah. And let me just add one thing. I agree with Allison with a caveat that, I believe if you continue to throw lots of money at systems that are continuing to do things the same way, it's going to be a problem, right? And sometimes when we have lots of resources, it doesn't squeeze and create the kind of pressure for you to rethink how you're actually doing business. So I'm a big advocate that, yeah, we need more money in public education, but we need to make the case for investing it in those things and those models and programs that actually are highly effective. And as Allison mentioned, change is really hard. The reality is there are people's jobs and programs that are tied to the current funding streams and the way they work. And when you start to disrupt that, it becomes all about the adults versus what's best for the kids in the system. That's a reality that we need to come to face with in this country.
I'm going to invite others to come back, everyone in the panel, but I want to see, Bob, do you have an example? Because I really am struck by, we can't just go back to doing things the way it was before the pandemic. We have to use what we know now to create something that is more effective. Yeah. Would you have an example of what that might look like that supported recovery in a place?
Yeah, so I would point to what one of our members did with a school in Colorado, Rob Anderson in Boulder Valley, which has a mix of different schools. There was the lowest performing school in this district was Alicia Sanchez Elementary. I think they had a 70+% free and reduced meal rate, and over 70% of the students are students of color. Well, they were the lowest performing in the district, one of the worst in the state, and were on some state watch lists. When he got the ESSER funds in, what they used that for was to change the weighted student funding formula. And so they started to send more money to schools to be able to use those funds in ways to meet the needs of their students. So bringing in more mental health workers, more multi-language support staff to address the needs of those students and some of the impacts that they were having. Well, in a short period of time, they were able to see exponential growth and actually showed up as one of the governor's Bright Spot Award schools in the state. But the point is they didn't just take the money and allocate it to the same system they had before. They fundamentally changed their whole budget and allocation process so that there was actually dollars being invested in ways that were more consistent with the needs of each school.
Thank you. I'm curious about, and we have some questions in chat. I want to get on this issue of bright spots and what works. So there is a question, don't know if anyone knows it. Is there research that shows that community schools fared better in terms of pandemic learning loss recovery or outcomes like absenteeism? I do think LPI just released a report that did some case study documentation of how community schools were able to really significantly reduce chronic absence, at least some schools in California. Anyone here know of other research on the kind of impact of community schools as an approach?
I mean, I think the community schools approach is on the right track. The challenge I find is that it's a program and it's an initiative within the system. It is not a systemic strategy to improving outcomes for all students. So I personally don't think you need to have community schools. You need to have community districts, right? Where the whole entire district has that framework in terms of how they connect with the community to make sure that all the kids have the resources and supports they have. And again, it's a recognition that school system can't be all things to all people. We'll never win at that game. We need to be much better at collaboration and partnerships to be able to get the job done. You know, it's always been said, it takes a village to raise a child. I think the pandemic should have made it very clear to us that's the best way out of this challenge and to a better future for serving kids in this country.
Absolutely. Well, and this kind of connects to one of the other questions that's in the Q&A, which is what's been done to look at eco or place-based approaches? I think partly what you're talking about, Bob, is district leaders need to see themselves as part of a place and create that kind of collaboration with their other partners in order actually to accelerate student learning.
Yep, 100%. Yeah.
Doug, I'm wondering about the research that you did. You didn't talk about you did talk about a coalition, but these are building coalitions across systems or coalitions that are more embedded in place and driven more by a deeper understanding of what are the issues locally that you need to respond to. Like that's part of what I heard in Bob's example of the school in Colorado that actually was able to, the district that was able to change outcomes. What did you see in your work about how do you work across agency, across maybe typical lines that exist in communities? And did you see anything in particular about what makes place-based approaches work?
Yeah, so I'm off mute. I would say a couple of the things that we looked at. So when we sort of look at that lens of that organ rejection point that I mentioned, right, where are you having real authentic two-way engagement with educators and families, or are you sort of just rolling something out? You see examples where, you know, the one example is in Colombia where there were monthly meetings with the leadership and principals across the country, right? So engaging 1,500 teachers, sharing information, et cetera. We got a chance to interview Kaya Henderson from her time back in DC Public Schools. And she said, you know, they were really aggressive about asking people 10 years from now, what should the district look like? What are your hopes and dreams? And she mentioned they had online portals, they had boxes in barbershops, beauty parlors, laundromats, and 10,000 people sort of wrote in, right? So there was a deliberate and investment in getting out there and having the conversation instead of it sort of feeling like we at central office will come up with a plan, announce it to you, and hope that you like it. So I would say that's sort of the closest analogy to this, but I think it's a reminder to engage earlier and start the conversation with communities more upfront instead of have it be what often happens, which is sort of the thing you get to as part of the rollout. It should be part of the design.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, another thing I'd say about the whole community engagement, you know, systems have historically, and I think it's currently the case, are not really transparent with parents of what actually is going on with their kids. So when I see a large school system with over 200,000 kids, and when they offer tutoring, and it was volunteer for parents to sign up, and they only got 1% of the kids to sign up for it, notwithstanding the fact that only a third to a quarter of their kids are proficient. You go and talk to parents, they're like, well, yeah, that might be true for the district, but my kid's okay, right? Well, actually, no, your kid's not okay, but they're not getting that information from the system about really where their kids are and what types of supports they need to engage in. And many parents will tell you if they knew, they would be more supportive and would be pushing on some of these things that are needed. So I think that's another piece of it as well. And it's particularly true in the case of trying to deal with issues like chronic absenteeism.
Yeah, I think of some of the research from Learning Heroes, Bob, you know, they did work together with the other, I think TNTP and other partners, where they found that if you ask families, are your kids fine or on grade level, 90% say yes, even though you see test scores that say, that's not really the case. And then they'll say, well, our kids are all getting Bs. So what does that mean? And they saw this also happening in places where there was increasing levels of chronic absence. How you have that honest dialogue with families so they both feel supported and connected, but also understand the reality of where their kids are. I'm wondering, Lucretia, because I think this challenge of also honest dialogue is particularly also true in communications with multilingual learners. Our systems aren't really well set up to communicate well with families who don't speak English. I'm not even sure we're good with families who do speak English, but then when you add another language into that, have you seen any examples of bright spots that have really effectively addressed the needs of multilingual learners and help to support and accelerate recovery?
Not super recently, but Patricia Gandara, who's here at UCLA, and I did a study of teachers that had high proportions of EL students in their classroom. And unsurprisingly, the majority of teachers found it hard to communicate with parents. But when you had bilingual teachers or teachers who had some sort of exposure to the community, and I don't mean by this that they had to be native speakers, but they were bilingual, or they valued biculturalism in ways, they found ways to communicate with parents. They found a way to reach them. They found a way to send these messages. I think the teacher link is really important. That is the first person, often the main person that parents interact with. A lot of parents do not want to come to the school site because of issues around their status or other issues, or just, it's hard to get there. So the teacher becomes really the first line of defense and the main interactor with parents. So to the degree that teachers are trained and feel capable of doing even if there's a language barrier, if they feel that they can reach parents in ways, they're going to feel that self-efficacy, and they're going to be more likely to open up and really find ways to communicate. Parents want to communicate with schools, and schools want to communicate with parents, but we have to find that sort of nexus where everyone feels like they can be effective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I also want to just encourage the audience, if you have questions for any of our speakers, or you have seen something really work in your community that you want others to see. I think about even the video that started off this webinar at the very beginning on the priorities that the Campaign for Grade Level Reading has, and how it's really looking at trying to create literacy-rich, learning-rich environments that not just happen in schools, but out of schools. And I think that ability to work collectively to improve outcomes for kids may be something that folks on this webinar also might have examples and thoughts. I'm still wondering, and I wonder, Megan, do we know anything? I know scaling up was hard, and I know lots of places didn't reach the dosage. But were there any positive outliers to that situation? And do we know anything about what allowed them to scale or enrich? I mean, one of the challenges with tutoring programs I'd heard is that we offered them, but they didn't get utilized. What do we know about how we need to do these things differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are definitely some lessons learned. One in particular, following themes that we've heard from other panelists, is involving the community in both awareness of the programs and enrollment, so that families who may not, have direct communication with the school, find out through other community organizations, hey, this is something that's being offered at the school or being offered at the summer. So I think increased awareness is helpful. And then I think one of the other big things is the partnership between the more integrated the tutors can be in the school community. So the tutors that are working with teachers working with educators rather than the model where it's really kind of just people filtering in and out of the school. They're not continuing to work with the same students over and over. Those are all things that can really help. I think the final one is just dosage. The program that we have found effective in this Road to Recovery report had 30 or more hours of instruction in a year. Lots and lots of the tutoring programs that were evaluated had somewhere like 4 to 10 hours total for the year, which just, you're not going to make a big difference if that's the amount that you get kids to show up for. So I think that, you know, it's really hard to get good tutors in, to get them to show up, to get kids to show up, but it's kind of that magic of getting, you know, really involved tutors, and which often seems to be more likely to happen if the tutors have some previous connection to the community or have taught in those schools before and maybe retired. Those types of factors often play a big role in kind of keeping the kids and teachers coming back.
Yeah.
There's an
I was just going to add another thing to tutoring. Look, tutoring is one of the most effective means to improve student learning and accelerate it, right? Be it parents with resources, that's what they do. They find tutors for their kids. If it wasn't working, they wouldn't be doing it. And so what happens is the ones that actually work well, it's an implementation problem, right? So the tutoring needs to be during the school day, needs to be integrated into it. It can't be volunteer outside of school. You need to have the same tutor that stays with the students throughout an extended period of time. And you need to offer it multiple times during the week. When you have that kind of high quality tutoring going on, so it's the quality of how you do it and how you execute that makes a difference. And so, you know, you can't look at an example in one system and say, well, hey, that didn't work. Well, they didn't execute it well. And tutoring, again, I think that's one of those opportunities that we need to take a serious look at nationally and figure out how to institutionalize that as much as possible. Leveraging folks in the community, our college students, lots of other resources to make it happen. There really should be a national program around tutoring where every kid in this country who needs tutoring should have access to it. I think that's an equity issue because, again, the folks with means, they're going to have their kids, they're going to get private tutors for their kids.
Right. Well, and I think there is emphasis on the proven tutoring models, which are also not only embedded, but are offering tutoring 3 to 4 times a week, are in small groups, are much more tailored towards a specific assessment of what each kid knows. So tutoring encompasses a broad range of things. Megan, when you looked at tutoring in your study, in that study, were they able to look at the quality issues and how much things corresponded to what we know are the most effective practices? And then there was a question about what was, I'm not sure I fully understand it, but what's the number of children in an out-of-school tutoring program that can prove the best results in your study?
Yeah, in terms of the second question, the research has found that no more than 3 students per tutor is kind of the ratio. So very small groups is ideal. I don't think we had any clear measures of quality of tutoring in that report. We did note dosage as well as who was the tutor, whether it was a community member, teacher, you know, paraprofessional. And all of those factors, as Bob mentioned, can, you know, there are just a number of implementation factors that can really make or break some of these programs.
So there are a couple other questions. One is, what's being done to look at environmental, nature-based programs? I think that's what they meant by place-based, where you're really using the environment as a means for learning and promoting learning in accelerating student growth. Has anyone here had a chance to look at place-based learning, and when you kind of really draw from a kid's environment and their own local community?
You know, one great example I could think of is what former Superintendent Chad Gueston did for Phoenix Union Schools, which is a district that's just high schools. I believe the 30 high schools are part of that district in Arizona. Before he left, he started a new type of high school where the school is the entire community. So students and their parents can decide if they want to enroll in this path, and the student will sit down with the counselors in the school, and they'll design their own learning journey that meets state requirements, but allows them to, they can spend a quarter of a day at the high school. They may take a course at another high school. They can do a dual entry at a local college, and they may actually have some kind of job somewhere that is something that's, of interest to them, that they're going to get credit for, and it's going to be some type of experiential learning. But the students are like all over the city, and the city becomes the environment for them. So, more creative ideas like that, I think, is certainly going to engage a lot more students.
Thank you. I'm wondering, I saw, Doug, you were starting to answer it, but it's kind of connected. It's more clarifying some things. There was a question about what's the difference between communities in schools versus community schools. Is that one you want to take on?
Well, what I don't know is my answer sort of local or more universal. I guess the term, and just putting myself back in the Chicago context, when people talk about community schools in Chicago, they're separating them from the charter schools and from magnet schools and others, right? Because it's a district where people make choices. So you get these debates about, should we be investing more in community schools, which people are referring to as sort of the schools that have been there for a long time, established in a given neighborhoods that typically draw from a local area, versus the other schools, which are ones that are selective enrollment or charters. But I just don't know if that's a Chicago.
I have a feeling this may be referring to Communities in Schools, which is a national organization that has a very specific model of how it operates and how it does integrated services with someone who works specifically at the school. Allison, you are nodding. So
I mean, I am not an expert, but my understanding is community schools, lowercase c, lowercase s, is a word to describe a model that has been talked about, like a broad model. Communities in schools, capital C, capital S, as you said, Hetty, is a national nonprofit organization trying to operationalize that model in a very specific way. So I would say like community schools is the umbrella. Communities in schools is one way to do it.
I want to go back to another question on this. Our teachers have mixed reviews on the SEL program. What do we know about how SEL impacts learning, and who is looking at this link? Is this
I can jump in here.
Yep, please.
I mean, we know that social and emotional and academic learning is one thing. Students come to school as full people and they need social, emotional, and academic supports. It's not surprising to me at all that an SEL curriculum might have mixed reviews, because that could mean so many things. And too often SEL programs are exactly that. They're a program tried to fit in the day. Too often they take a deficit approach in an effort to fix children, not fix systems. And so without knowing what that program is, I couldn't possibly say why it has mixed reviews, but I would encourage you to check out the resources of our partners at Castle. They have a lot of resources on social emotional learning. And then I'm happy to put in the chat EdTrust's own scan, which prompts folks to look at what systems are doing to support student social and emotional learning, while, in the broader context, not just a specific 20-minute program that happens once a week.
So go ahead, Bob, please.
I was going to give you a specific school system example. Henry County in Georgia, when it was headed by Mary Elizabeth Davis, who recently moved to another county. They implemented the Henry Cares program, which essentially had a designated individual in every school that coordinated these social, emotional, mental health supports with a team in every school that they call the CARE team, which is a caring adult responding every day. and they use their ESSER dollars to do that, and it turned out to be a very effective model. And the reason I point that out is, what Allison was actually saying, you've got these programs on the side. Well, they try to integrate a lot of their SEL into the professional learning and what was actually happening in the classroom. So that was another big part of the investment that they put together. So having these care teams to support the teachers, and then providing training and figuring out how they can integrate these concepts within the instructional day is a strategy that seemed to be promising.
Thank you. I think one of the big takeaways from all of this is that we can and should, especially as our dollars are decreasing, use our data to understand both what's working and where things aren't working. And if they're not working, that can, I think, maybe help to instigate a whole set of things. One, finding out from kids and families, as you said, Doug, it's need to be a two-way approach to finding out what challenges are and engaging in dialogue so we understand what might be helpful. We also have to look at if we were implementing a solution, why is it, did we even implement it in the way intended? Do we even have the dosage and the scale, and what might else we may be able to do to actually achieve the goals that we were wanting? And that I think what you are also offering up, Bob, is that part of what we can be doing is really not just thinking about how do we build back to what we were before, but how are we learning from all these experiences to create systems that will work for a future. Anyways, I want to just appreciate everyone here for all of your incredible insights, for helping us kind of take it's a bit of a sobering picture, but I also think that we are seeing places where we can take inspiration and figure out how to move forward. I see the poll up here, and I am going to turn it back to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading staff to close us out.
Thank you, Hetty, for this conversation today. Thank you to each of you for the thoughts and the ideas that you've contributed. It's really impactful for us to have this place and space to talk about ways that our partners, our communities can both, to use some of Allison's language, both push in and be advocates for and provide that covering, that support. And so I hope that everyone who's had the opportunity to listen today found lots of things. There's been lots of resources shared. All of those will be included in the follow-up email. So if you miss something, if you're having trouble accessing it, you will have the ability to access it there. We'd ask you to take a moment and fill out that poll. In addition, I just dropped in the chat an evaluation survey. And if there's something that you're thinking about that you're going to do as follow-up to this, we want to hear that from you. And so we'd love to have you take some time and answer those couple of questions. And then as we wrap up for today, I just want to say to all of you, please plan to come to one of the next sessions. For those of you who are interested in place-based learning and learning through play, I'd encourage you to check out some of those Kindergarten Matters series. We do have a session on play-based learning in the kindergarten classroom and beyond. And so that may be a place to start thinking some of those thoughts that maybe this wasn't your panel for your question, but there are places for that within the campaign and the work that we're doing. I'd also, on that topic, there's some things in our archives. And so don't forget that we have a website that archives all of our past GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars, and that's a great place to jump in. But I will also mention that we do have coming up on the 22nd a session on building stronger teacher pipelines through university district partnerships. And of course, we have SEL Goes to the Olympics and to Classroom and Schools on October 29th. And so thank you all one more time for joining us. And it was a pleasure to have you share in this conversation today.